Hi, my name is Caitlin. My presentation is on American Indians and Alaska Natives. I wasn't able to figure out how to combine this video with the sharing of my screen, and so I'm just going to upload them separately in the same assignment folder. So they are together, but I couldn't figure that out. Anyway, so the opening slide is just the title page and my name. Now the second slide, it shares the therapist knowledge. So this is just going over characteristics, cultural values, strengths, discrimination issues, microaggressions, things like that. It's going to answer some questions. What does the research and literature say about mental health issues? Is it related to historical experience? What conclusions can be drawn based on the literature? So, according to the text, our class text, the American Indian Alaska Native population is about 9.7 million people, representing nearly 3% of the United States population. Now, this population grew by 160% between 2010 and 2020. These numbers are fascinating, especially considering the recent growth. When we consider the Native American population decline by nearly 90 to 95%, when Europeans introduced devastating diseases that nearly wiped out an entire population, this growth is promising. However, there are some significant struggles, right, when it comes to health statistics, and it all goes back to the history of colonization and persistent racial oppression and restricted access to power and sovereignty. The text discusses how this population is almost invisible, and man, that was so sad to read that and have that word, that description. It just hurt my heart a little bit. And to think that they consider this population almost invisible, in quotes, literally invisible, because the available data that we do have about this population is devastating, and it's concerning because it says that the death rate of any cause from anything, of any cause, by any cause, is nearly 50% higher for American Indian Alaska Native persons than for white individuals, and that has a lot to do with the lack of data we have, and it all goes back to this invisibility, and that's sad. Cultural values, they're vast and they're very difficult to identify. I was going at it through a detailed microscope for a while. That was not the way to go because it is too vast. Because there are so many variations of these values depending on the family and the tribe. So I landed on 4 that kind of encompass all, right? They all have variations of them, but they're shared across the board, and it's these four bases, foundational values. And it's sharing, cooperations, non-interference, and spirituality. Unlike the majority culture today in the United States, where we value surplus of material goods as a form of status and respect, American Indian and Alaska Native peoples actually prioritize sharing as a way to gain honor and respect. That was really cool. Cooperation. So for American Indian Alaska Native peoples, cooperation, or having a harmonious relationship, is vital to the tribe and family. It's the foundation in which these communities operate, and it will always take priority over the individual. Now, this in turn tells us about the children and young people in this culture, because children are often sensitive to the opinions and attitudes of their peers, and may actively avoid disagreements or contradiction. Most do not like to be singled out and make to perform in school unless the whole group benefits. This was a heavy one for me. This cooperation seemed like one of the most foundational points over the whole entire value system. And it was most relatable in that I work at a local school district here, and we have a growing Native population. And this is so apparent beyond anything I could have ever... Man, I'm just rethinking every interaction I've had, or just how I communicate. How do I communicate effectively with them, because growing up in a white household is vastly different. And so it's just very interesting, especially that piece of actively avoiding disagreement and contradiction. So they might even be, they won't participate as much, and then be talked to about their participation, but in reality, it's just their willingness or unwillingness to do so is actually out of the spirit of cooperation. So that was interesting. The principle of non-interference in American Indian and Alaska Native cultures is a core value that emphasizes autonomy, interdependence, and the maintenance of community harmony by avoiding coercion and direct intervention. It actually fosters peace. So, in other words, of all those big words, it fosters peace would have probably been an easier way to just say that. But it does so by allowing individuals to learn from their own actions and show respect for their choices rather than imposing one's will on another person. While it discourages meddling, right, getting into other people's business, especially from an outsider perspective, it's not the same thing as unwillingness to act. Rather, it's a belief that individuals should be given the space to make their own decisions and live their own lives. And that's also that's a good perspective shift, right? It's not necessarily an unwillingness. It's just, I have the freedom to make my own choices. Some key aspects of non-interference is autonomy and choice. Individuals being given freedom and choices without coercion. Interdependence in community. It supports the balance between individual autonomy and the group's need for harmony and mutual respect. Learning from experience. It allows individuals to learn and to grow from the outcomes of their decisions, including their mistakes. Conflict prevention. By discouraging direct intervention, especially in a judgmental or forceful way, it helps to actually prevent interpersonal conflict. And then respect for boundaries, right? It respects the unspoken relational boundaries between people, including different generations and community members. Again, a lot of these points I can piece to lots of other cultures and just being a person, right? But I think it also speaks to the necessity for cultural competence because it explains things very differently from that perspective. And I'm learning that, and I think that that's really fascinating. How non-interference is expressed. Now, I thought so learning about non-interference, there's a lot of information about it, and so it was really fun to read a lot of the stuff, but learning how it can be expressed, but also how it's misunderstood, right? It's misrepresented, or how we as hearers misunderstand the information. So first we're going to start with how it's expressed. So this value, right? We're still on values. Non-interference. It can be expressed through indirect communication. So criticism is often communicated indirectly through storytelling, humor, or by a third party rather than just direct confrontation. This is how it's expressed, this non-interference, right? It's not direct. It's also expressed having respect for their elders, right? In group settings, deference is shown to elders, so they will defer to, allowing them to speak first without interruption. It's also expressed through subtle suggestion. So instead of directives, suggestions are offered subtly and without pressure, respecting the other person's self-determination. And it's also expressed with patience. It's a principle that values patience, believing things will happen in their own time rather than forcing an outcome on a schedule. Now, non-interference also has the potential to be misunderstood in a few ways. The first one is non-action versus non-interference. Now, this was kind of what I talked a little bit about earlier with the students at the school I work at. Knowing the difference between an unwillingness to act versus a belief in allowing choice, right? And that's what this is, non-action versus non-interference. Non-interference, again, is not the same thing as failure or an unwillingness to act, but it's a belief in allowing choices. It can also be misunderstood just by cultural differences, right? For non-native individuals, this principle can be really confusing as it can seem to contradict our white value, right, of being your brother's keeper. And it can also be misunderstood by the effective services. So in effective services, in professional settings, this principle requires providers to offer choices and explore alternatives because without being directive. Because one, it'll help their outcome, but it allows the client to come to their own conclusion. The next value to move away from non-interference is the value of spirituality. Now, this value for American Indian and Alaska Native peoples is a foundational element of existence that's integrated into every aspect of their life, community, and identity. Due to this integration, they don't see daily life, community, and identity as separate things, right? It's integrated. Rather, it's characterized by a deep sense of harmony, respect for nature, a strong community bond. It's important to note that there's actually no single Native American religion. Spirituality is really more of an encompassing word for it, and it's highly diverse across the hundreds of distinct tribes and regions, with specific practices varying significantly between them all. Many American Indian, Alaska Native individuals today also blend traditional spiritual practices with more, what one might say, mainstream faiths, or such as like Christianity, right? The specific beliefs of an individual should be inquired about in the professional setting directly, because many traditional practices are actually considered sacred and not for public sharing, which was really intriguing to me too, to know that. Like, it's their own, that's just, it was, I don't know, that's special. These people have a beautiful and plentiful history where they prospered in complex cultural systems for at least 20,000 years before European colonization. Again, that's from our text. From years of extermination and seizure, this population was decimated and the culture was left broken. You know, I'm not a big fan of the old adage, like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I'd actually change it. What doesn't kill you leaves you with two options. One, learning joy in chaos and pain. Or two, living in perpetual victimhood. The trauma does not make you stronger. The trauma is traumatic. It's what you choose to do with it after that makes the difference. American Indian, Alaska Native populations had to endure genocide and assimilation efforts, and were able to do so because of their resistance efforts and their cultural values and their strengths, such as spirituality, respect for traditional values and ceremonies, extended family networks, allegiances to family, community, and tribe, wisdom of the elders, respect for the environment and the land, connection to the past, adaptability, the promotion of these themes of belonging, mastery, independence, and generosity. Again, we can find that same exact thing in our text. So moving away from values, let's talk about racism. So racism also plays a critical role in the physical health disparities, which has a direct correlation to American Indian, Alaska Native mental health issues. American Indians, Alaska Natives are subject to widespread cultural misrepresentations, ranging from intrusive questions about ethnic identity to Native-themed sports team mascots. Racial microaggressions are linked to negative physical health, mental health, and academic consequences. In fact, there was actually a recent study, and it examined microaggressions experienced by American Indian, Alaska Natives post-secondary students in New Mexico and Oklahoma. Microaggression prevalence ratings and associated distress were compared across region, gender, income, age, and cultural involvement. Results actually showed microaggressions were highly prevalent among American Indian, Alaska Native students in New Mexico and Oklahoma, and varied by demographic and cultural factors. Increased American Indian, Alaska Native microaggressions research is needed to bring awareness, education, and solutions to this growing issue. American Indian, Alaska Native individuals face significant mental health challenges, including higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, substance abuse, and other conditions. Disparities in mental health are linked to factors like limited healthcare access, cultural factors, and the impact of intergenerational trauma. Addressing these disparities requires culturally competent care, which recognizes and incorporates traditional healing practices, in other words, a holistic view of well-being, And that has to include connections to family, community, and environment. Common mental health challenges. Again, we just briefly touched on those. PTSD, substance abuse, depression and anxiety, right? Intergenerational trauma and violence. This is a significant risk factor, right? Violence is. Factors that are contributing to mental health disparities are limited healthcare access, cultural misalignment, underfunded services, systemic inequalities, right? So we've got limited healthcare, so barriers. That's a huge barrier to accessing culturally appropriate and affordable mental health services. The cultural misalignment. So this is like traditional healthcare models that may not be aligned with American Indian, Alaska Native worldviews, which then emphasize interconnectedness, family, and nature, right? How do you combine those two? Underfunded services. The Indian Health Service, IHS, is frequently understaffed and underfunded, which limits the services available. And then, of course, you have the systemic inequalities, historical trauma, poverty, limited access to education. Now, there are multiple pathways with all of this heaviness to culturally competent care. One of those is cultural competence, which is what we're doing right now, right? Healthcare providers, mental health providers, etc., need to be trained to understand and respect cultural beliefs and values of these individuals. Also having a holistic approach, so mind, body, soul. This care should focus on reestablishing balance and wholeness and addressing, addressing an individual's connection to their family, community, and environment. How does that impact their physical health, their mental health? Because it's all connected. Integrating traditional healing. Culturally congruent interventions can be developed by incorporating traditional healing practices and knowledge. And then community-led initiatives is a good one as well. Some tribes are taking greater control of their behavioral health services through compacts with IHS, which allows them to better tailor services to their members' needs. I worked at Volunteers of America before I started working for the school district, and I was a peer specialist. And I went to this convention, and one of the gals that was speaking at this convention was Native. I can't remember what tribe affiliation she belonged to, but she got up and spoke a lot about substance abuse and mental health and the violence and trauma that's experienced on reservations, and how a lot of it's a very complex issue. It's not as simple as just, this is the right answer, we just need to do this, or they're being dramatic, or whatever, all the other excuses we hear all the time, right? It's not that simple. It just isn't. And so hearing from her, someone who lives it every single day, day in and day out, working through a lot of these issues with people that she cares about, as someone who has gone through recovery, right? And she has been through recovery, mental health, substance abuse recovery, and now she's going back into her culture to address these massive issues. And one of the most powerful things that I learned from her was that I don't know how to express it properly. She just said that, she said that the issues on the reservations stem so much deeper than just alcoholism and violence. And when she said that, I was like, what's deeper than trauma? What's, oh my goodness. But then I understood kind of what she meant. And historically, there's a lot of intergenerational garbage, I guess, that's passed down through generations that is affecting today's people. And to know that history is still affecting them, even though they weren't part of that, right? But their people were. Because again, it's that perpetuation that just was never handled or talked about, and never received that justice, right? Never I don't know, it's very complex. And so it was very interesting to learn all of this information and also piece together all the things I learned from that front. So it's just interesting to think about. And when I think about like a conclusion, I guess, that can be drawn from the literature on American and Native and Alaska Indian. Oh my gosh, American Indian, Alaska Native people, can be summed up actually very briefly. Because that's a lot of information I just talked about, but it really is simple. These people are severely underserved and are desperate for culturally competent care. And that's the conclusion I believe I can draw from this literature. Now, if you go to my second slide, therapist awareness. This one's what culturally sensitive interventions approaches are offered as a clinical mental health counselor, and what are some of the things that you should consider when treating American Indians and Alaska Native populations. So a clinical mental health counselor can offer culturally sensitive interventions for these people, for all clients actually, but for them specifically by incorporating community strengths, incorporating holistic approaches, and respecting their spiritual traditions. Key approaches include strengths-based model, respecting the wisdom of their elders and the interconnectedness of mind, body, and spirit, that holistic approach, and adapting to specific tribal customs and historical trauma. Culturally sensitive approaches for clinical mental health counselors look like adopting a holistic and strengths-based perspective, again, incorporating community tribal strengths, addressing historical trauma, respecting the wisdom of elders, all of the things we just listed, but then also adapting the therapeutic environment. So making, say, my office more welcoming by using culturally relevant art, maybe pottery or baskets, and ensuring that my intake forms can be adapted or translated if needed. Develop cultural humility, right? That's huge. Continuously working on assessing my own beliefs, acknowledging my own biases, adapting behaviors to show respect for my clients' cultural beliefs and norms. Those are all really important. When treating American Indian, Alaska Native populations, healthcare providers, including therapists and counselors, need to adopt a culturally humble and patient-centered approach, right? Client-centered approach that acknowledges historical trauma, respects diverse cultural beliefs and communication styles, and it addresses significant health disparities. A lot of this information I was researching was actually for nurses, which is really interesting. But it makes sense, and it's just as applicable. So, cultural humility and communication. A foundational principle is to practice cultural humility, recognizing that each client is a unique individual, right? And that tribal cultures vary greatly across the regions. So avoiding stereotypes. We don't want to make assumptions about clients' beliefs, practices, or lifestyle based on their cultural identity. We want to actually encourage them to share their personal and unique cultural identity with us. Establishing trust and rapport is huge. So being genuine, but also being professional, avoiding intrusive questions too early on, explaining my role in that therapist-client relationship very clearly, and what I plan to do when documenting information while I'm with them, I think is also really very important. But also having a lot of respect for their communication style. In other words, being very comfortable with silence. I didn't used to be comfortable with silence, but I kind of love it now. I really do. I live for that those silent moments of like self-reflection and processing and all that. I think it's interesting. It may be, but anyway, aside from the fact that it's interesting, for the respect of their communication, it may be a sign of respect or of contemplation, not necessarily disengagement. Allowing clients, they're not patients, allowing them to tell us their story fully before getting too specific with questions. We don't want to be intrusive, right? Eye contact, that's a big one, right? It varies between tribes, but we don't want to force clients to make eye contact with us. Again, clear language, using very clear language, storytelling, real life examples to explain things, respecting community and family. In other words, decisions about their healthcare choices, they might be made together, right, as the tribe or as the community or their family, and being respectful and open to that and involving them in that. And then integrating traditional practices in Western medicine. So American Indian, Alaska Native populations have a long tradition of medicine and healing that often includes, like we've mentioned a lot already, the holistic view of health, mind, body, spirit, and of course, environment. So coordinating care, being open to patients, incorporating traditional practices, sweat lodges, uses of herbs, smudging, collaborate with traditional healers if that's what they need, that really takes in the whole person for their well-being. And then respecting sacred items, medicine bags, jewelry, hair. Without being given explicit permission, those things generally don't touch them, Now, as a counselor, I can't imagine I would ever be touching anything even remotely close to my client, but it's something to know, just for cultural competence sake as to why they might be upset about something. It's a big deal. So, and then acknowledging historical context in health disparities, which we talked a lot about actually already, but the historical trauma from centuries of intentional government policies has a profound impact on health outcomes and a pervasive medical mistrust among a lot of these individuals. Not just, mental health, but like it's affecting everything. And understanding those health disparities, right? Knowing what there's a higher prevalence of. Being mindful of access to barriers. So some of those health disparities to be aware of is diabetes, cardiovascular disease, liver disease, mental health disorders, right? The lower life expectancy in this population often is all linked to this socioeconomic factor and those environmental risks. And then being mindful of access to barriers, of access barriers. Recognizing that these barriers could include all kinds of things from geographic isolation, traveling costs, long waiting times, and insufficient funding, right, for the IHS, the Indian Health Services. And many of those living in urban areas may not even be eligible for IHS services, right? I mean, that could just be based on region. So by understanding and respecting these complex factors, as a future provider, I can build trust, as all of us who are providers or future providers, we can build trust and deliver more effective, client-centered, person-centered. I don't even like the word client. It's just too jargony. Person-centered care, right? We can build trust and we can deliver more effective, person-centered and culturally sensitive care. Now for my third slide. This is the therapist skills, do's and don'ts. And what can you draw from as a conclusion? Well, therapists should build rapport by being patient, present, and respectful listeners, by also avoiding intrusive questions and imposing personal values. It's crucial to be culturally humble, acknowledge potential mistrust, and understand that clients can express themselves differently, such as through silence, less eye contact. It's important that I don't assume, right, that we don't, assume a uniform cultural identity, but rather be curious and allow the client to share, the hiccups, to share their experiences at their own pace. Therapist do's. Be present and listen. Don't talk too fast. I'm going to need to work on that. Being comfortable with pauses. Establishing rapport. Take the time to build that trust because it's essential to show that we're invested in that individual and in their community. Being culturally humble, acknowledging when I have limited cultural knowledge, and being open to learning from the client, but also recognizing what I can also be researching on my own. Validate and be curious. So validating their concerns and experiences and being genuinely curious about their life and culture, not making assumptions. Honoring their unique communication styles, correctly pronounce their names, using it correctly and respectfully. That's super important. I had a friend, this was a long time ago, it seems like. This was in my undergrad, and he's native. He and his family all are. And he goes by Black Hawk. And that was his name. But people who didn't know him very well called him Tonto. And people in his close community called him Black Hawk. And then people who were even closer to him called him Machiavelli, because that was his middle or his center name. And he's since passed, actually killed, unfortunately. He and his mother, and it's just really devastating, and brother, really devastating. So it just speaks to how prevalent the issues are, I guess, in this, but also how important it is, even with something as simple as pronouncing someone's name. Like if say he had come in and I didn't know him very well and I called him Machiavelli, that'd be so disrespectful. Like, I would never be able to do that. Even we were friends, but I could still never call him that, like, out of respect for him. And so, the names is a big one. Accepting, moving on though, sorry. Another do is accepting offers of hospitality. If a client offers a drink or a snack, accept it as a sign of rapport. And then ask questions about cultural identity. Now, don'ts. Don't interrupt or rush. Don't impose your values. Don't make assumptions. Don't act as a white savior. Recognize that sounds harsh, but we want to recognize that trust in non-native professionals and mainstream services is not going to necessarily come easily for many people due to historical trauma or discrimination. Don't take photos or touch sacred items. Don't claim vague affiliations. And don't talk too loud or too fast. The American Indian Alaska Native population, now numbering nearly 9.7 million people, has grown significantly in recent years, despite centuries of devastating population loss, colonization, and systemic oppression. Do I need to go to the next slide? Nope. Sorry. Oppression. This history continues to shape health outcomes today. American Indian Alaska Native communities experience disproportionately high mortality rates, significant mental health challenges, and persistent racial microaggressions. Their cultural values, including sharing, cooperation, non-interference, and spirituality, form the foundation of community life and resilience, emphasizing harmony, autonomy, respect for elders, and an overall holistic connection between mind, body, spirit, land, and family. These values have helped American Indian Alaska Native peoples endure genocide, forced assimilation, racial trauma, and ongoing inequities, while also influencing communication styles, decision-making, and approaches to healing. Given these complex histories and cultural strengths, American Indian Alaska Native individuals require mental health care that honors tribal diversity, incorporates traditional healing, and respects community-centered worldviews. Culturally competent and culturally humble clinical practice involves building trust slowly, validating experiences of historical and contemporary trauma, and adapting communication to include patience, indirect dialogue, and comfort with silence. Effective providers avoid assumptions, collaborate with traditional healers when appropriate, integrate family and community and care, and create welcoming environments that honor cultural identity. By approaching clients with curiosity rather than stereotyping, respecting sacred items and spiritual practices, and recognizing systemic barriers to healthcare, mental health counselors can offer care that's not only effective, but affirming, supporting healing through both cultural strengths and clinical expertise. You can find my reference page and my summary with this, as well as my sites at the end of my slideshow. Thank you so much for listening.